enhanced data protection for every EU citizen in a member state. And why does it exist in the first place? Well, it's to give control back to the data owner, and it's to bring the regulations up to date with technology, and lastly to have a unified regulation across all of the member states. Why should you be bothered? I know you all know it, but the fines are pretty big. In fact, it's not that boring a topic, because otherwise you wouldn't be sitting here. It's the only reason that everyone sat up and listened to this regulation. 20 million euros or 4% of turnover, whichever is higher. And how might you prepare for it? Well, give yourself more than 37 days, so hopefully everybody's started already. Ensure awareness through your organisation from top to bottom, so you need buy-in at exec level. Map your data. You need to know what data you hold, how it enters your organisation and how it leaves. Review your privacy notice. I've looked at a few of our own clients and other people as well, and at the moment they're not compliant. You need to explain your lawful basis for processing. Look at your policies and procedures, review and update them. There's new rights for the individual under GDPR, and you need those policies in place to be able to react, the right to erasure and so on. And also data breach. I'll bet there's plenty of people in the room that don't have a policy or an effective one on how to respond to a data breach. Consent, which we'll touch on again later, is a big one. You need to review and modify how you seek and manage consent. And despite a lot of the advice that's out there, in my opinion, you should consider at least appointing a DPO, a data protection officer, or if not, making someone explicitly responsible within your organisation for those necessary tasks. Check your cyber security and your technology and make sure you're using the best of it. And carry out data protection impact assessments. So look at the technology you've got, the programs that are holding personal data, and run a DPI against them now and in the future. So any new ones that you take on. Excuse me. And ultimately, you need to know your position against the regulation. There's only one way you can know that, and that's with some kind of gap analysis process. So you map your position against the regulation, you look at the holes, and then you go and fill them. So the three pillars of GDPR, this is my own opinion, it's not anyone else's necessarily, but you need to find ways of managing data. So we all hold it, but you need to be able to manage it, and you need to be able to protect it. And in order to do those two things, you need to blend people, process and technology. There's no single person or product that will give you GDPR compliance. There's lots that claim they will, but it's not true. You need to have a real blend of those three in order to complete your journey. And GDPR isn't just for your IT department, it's particularly not for your IT department. They play an important role, but there's plenty of other people who need to be involved. You'll need to train your users, so not just the exec level buy-ins, but all of your users on how to handle data, how to spot a subject access request, and so on. And process, it's quite likely that any breach may well come from human error and not a technology failure. So you need to train your users all the way through, and there need to be the policies to back up the training that you're giving them. And if we just consider for a minute some of the product lines in Mimecast that will help you with your data protection and your data management, and Dan's going to go through these in more detail. It can also help with your people element, your human element, using technology to educate you and make better decisions when you click on an email, when you open a link. There's data leak prevention technologies to ensure certain data doesn't leave your organisation. There's inbound malware protection to stop infection that can lead to a breach in the first instance. And of course encryption, that's a really, really big one. It's one of the technologies that's actually called out in GDPR. And Mimecast can provide encryption both in transit and at rest. And Mimecast will also help you to identify, if you do have a breach, what data has gone out and where it's gone, and when you stopped it. And all that evidence is really, really important if you're reporting back to the ICO. And there's a number of rights of the individual in GDPR, which I'm sure you're all familiar with now. I'm just going to talk about 3 of them. There's the right to access. So a subject access request, you'll have 1 month to respond. Much of that data is going to be within email, so you need to be able to not just have the technology, but know how to use it to gather that data. And subject access requests are predicted to just skyrocket after the 25th. There'll be nuisance makers, people who know the rules, they'll be coming from all directions. You can also prove the chain of custody over that data using Mimecast. There's also the right to erasure, so better known as the right to be forgotten. You'll need to be able to ensure complete erasure across all your systems, and again, Mimecast can help you to prove that. And data portability. If somebody wants their data back, and you need to be able to provide it in a usable format, and again, you're going to be against the clock, so you need to know how you're doing that pretty quickly. And the last one I want to just consider is the 5th principle within GDPR. Personal data should only be stored for as long as necessary and for the purpose for which the data was collected. So you need to be purging your personal data at the time you said you were going to, and you need to tell the data subjects at the point of first engagement how long you're keeping their data. And again, Mimecast can help you set those data retention policies and automated schedules as well. And again, Dan's going to give us a bit more info on that shortly. And then lastly, I said I've mentioned some of these companies that have struggled today. So Flybe, for example, they were fined £70,000 for asking people by email who had already opted out to check their details were still correct. So whilst they were trying to comply with GDPR, they fell foul of the privacy and electronic communication regulation. And Honda sent 290,000 emails aiming to clarify customers' choices for marketing, but they had no evidence whatsoever that these people had ever opted in. They were unable to provide that at all, so they had no consent in the first instance. So both companies sent emails asking for consent, and in doing so they broke the current law. And there's a ton of this going on. You all would have received these saying, please click here, we need to be able to continue to talk to you and give you product information. And there's a big school of thought that says that's completely unnecessary. So if we consider legitimate interests, so you all have marketing databases and you may well have started on that journey, but legitimate interests is the most flexible, lawful basis for processing, and it's likely to be the most appropriate when you process people's data in the way they would reasonably expect, and which have a minimal privacy impact. So if you're telling them about your products and services, that meets both of those. And interestingly, legitimate interests can be your own interests, it can be third-party interests, and they can be commercial interests. So if you do use legitimate interests, which you may well consider as your lawful basis for processing, there's 2 main things you need to do. You need to keep a record of your legitimate interests assessment, and you can only do that if you've done one, so that will be part of your gap analysis. If you haven't got an LIA, then you need one. And you need it so you can demonstrate compliance if anyone questions you. And you should include details of your legitimate interests in your privacy notice. So when you first engage with people, you need to be telling them why you think you can do that under the legitimate interests rule. Anthony Gold Solicitors, this is December last year, so pretty recent. They had 16,000 emails sent out from genuine email accounts with the title "Action Required, Matter for Attention." They contained malicious links and malicious attachments, and they were highly credible because they came from real email accounts. And it's highly likely that they didn't have 2-factor authentication. They were relying on a username and password, and they suffered a pretty horrific breach. And only last month, Duncan Lewis, one of the biggest providers of legal aid in the UK, 420 plus staff, they were hacked, and all that harvested data was posted on social media, including personal information. And we haven't heard from the ICO on that, but I guess they're pretty glad it happened now and in a month's time. And then the big one, of course, DLA. The outgoing CIO, Chief Information Officer, made a speech recently, and whilst they're a much bigger entity than any of us, there's some really good insights. I'm just going to read some of those out on how quickly you can be effective and how quickly you would need to react. So on the 27th of June at 11:17 a.m, their help desk took their first call, and they weren't sure what it was, but it looked like some kind of virus infection on the desktop. By noon, every single Windows device in their environment was down, and by 1 p.m. that day, DLA took the decision to take down their entire global network. No email, no telephony, no Skype, no link, no communication at all. They had to resort to WhatsApp and personal email, so they're transferring client data, personal data on personal email accounts. It wasn't until day 13 that they had their desktops, email and document management back, and they had to wait until day 35 for telephony. They're estimating the cost in the small millions, and that's just what it cost them to actually fix. That's not including reputational costs. They only held cyber insurance in the US and nowhere else. And he said in his speech, we would be fools not to consider it going forwards. And in the same speech, he closed his speech by saying, when it's all gone, how are you going to operate without email? Now, DLA weren't a Mimecast customer and therefore couldn't rely on a continuity email service. They had to go to personal email. And now, if you imagine any of those events, even in smaller form, happening to you after the 25th of May, you might accelerate your journey a little bit now. In my opinion, GDPR is a bit of a game changer. There are big fines coming, and it's why we're all sitting here today. So, I'll start by saying your email stores will hold a ton of personal data. It's how we operate, particularly in the barrister market. There's no DMS. Your data's in email. And if you want to have any chance of managing and protecting that data in accordance with GDPR, then you'll need some really smart technology to help you. So thank you for listening so far. I'm going to hand over to Dan, who will take you through the Mimecast product lines.
Great. Thank you. Morning, everyone. It's great to be here this morning. It seems like quite opportune that Mimecast obviously focuses on email, and we're talking about how important email is from a GDPR point of view. But it essentially is, and I think we all know why, right? Because email is still the #1 communication tool. Matt mentioned numbers, and email use is continuing to go up. I think for over a decade already, people have been talking about the death of email. There's new instant messaging tools, whether it's Skype or whether it's Slack or whatever the new tool is that's going to mean that email usage is going down. But that hasn't happened at all. There's some good analysis from an analyst firm, Radicati, who basically plot email usage continuing to go up, which is probably not good news for all of us, given the volume of email we all get every day. But as a communication tool, it's still #1. What's even more worrying, as if we don't get enough email and we rely on it too heavily, is that it's the #1 way that attackers are getting into all of our organizations. It has been for a while, it continues to be, and no matter what type of business, no matter what size, if you think about it, email is a internet-facing technology in all of our businesses, and it's the easiest way for somebody to get something. All they need is your email address, and somebody can get something onto your desktop, in your inbox. They don't have to mess around trying to get through firewalls and trying to get through any other intrusion prevention. So email really is used massively. When it's not there, we all know about it. Attackers are using it every single day to try and get into our organizations, steal data, cause disruption. And from a GDPR point of view, as Matt said, it holds a huge amount of personal data. So it really is an important area to consider as part of GDPR readiness. Obviously, it's not the only area. It'd be quite nice and straightforward and simple if it was. But there are other applications which we all use that also need to be considered, right? But just before I get started, I mean, I'm hoping I won't be disappointed this morning when I ask this question, but given the audience here today, but how many existing Mimecast customers in the room? No, I'm not disappointed. Fantastic. Well, I mean, you're ahead of the game, and I would say that, but the bottom line is that there are some really great tools and I'll talk through some of the things. This is not a Mimecast sales pitch. It doesn't need to be. I'm preaching to the choir here, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the types of things that to be thinking about and the types of capabilities to be thinking about in terms of using that to help on your GDPR journey. So, there we go. I don't know if you can all read that, hopefully, but you'll start hearing this from a number of vendors, right? A lot of our customers, were coming to us and saying, look, we want some sort of commitment from you that you guys are going to be ready, so that if I'm using your technology come 25th of May, I'm going to be in a good position, and I'm confident that if the regulators come knocking, I can say, look, these are the things we've done, these are the processes we've put in place, this is the technology we use, and yes, I have that confirmation from the vendors that we're using that they are doing all the right things from a GDPR and data protection point of view. So we've publicly come out and basically made that commitment that by 25th of May latest, we will be compliant and be able to support all of our customers on their own compliance. There's some good information if you haven't taken a look at it already at the link at the bottom there. This is part of our Trust Center, GDPR specific section of our Trust Center. So if you're interested, you can go there to find out more information as well. And, wrong way. Mark French is our Chief Trust Officer and Data Protection Officer. And ultimately, responsibility for GDPR rests on his shoulders. He comes from a CISO background. But the point and why I'm mentioning him as well, on that GDPR Trust Center page, you'll actually, his contact information is there. So obviously, if you have questions, you can either go through your usual channels, through Sprout, if you have in direct contact with Mimecast as well. But feel free to contact Mark as well, because he is there to do exactly that, to help support both our own compliance, but also our customers as well. So what I wanted to cover this morning is broken up into these two areas. I'm going to talk about data protection, and I'm going to talk about data management. And I think it hopefully is fairly clear as to why these areas are important. They sort of mirror the pillars that Matt talked about just earlier. But I'm going to sort of step through each of these. We don't have a massive time this morning, so I'm going to sort of step through them reasonably quickly, but there is a huge amount of information available that sits behind each one of these, and I'm here this morning. I've got colleagues here this morning as well if you have any further questions as well. So let's make a start talking about malware protection and why that's important from a GDPR point of view. So obviously, as we know, GDPR is all around protecting personal data. Anything that's personally identified or individually identifiable. What we're trying to protect it against is a breach. Email is the number one way that people are trying to get into our organization and breach the information that we hold, breach our systems, cause disruption, etc. Take information hostage. So being able to protect with the right tools to stop the breach in the first place, well, that's going to go a long way to enforcing that level of protection. So the way that people are coming in via email, you would have heard some of these terms, you'll be familiar with them, but things like ransomware, where they're taking data hostage. Not only are they taking it hostage and demanding a ransom, but quite often, increasingly, actually they're saying, well, if you don't pay up, we're going to post it online. From a GDPR point of view, that's like a nightmare, right? Not only don't you have access to your data, but it's going to potentially be in the public domain. Other things like phishing, so phishing typically where you're going to get a link, you're going to click on it, you're going to look like you're putting your login details into whatever system. It looks realistic, but actually it's a fake site and they've just stolen your details. And unless you have things like two-factor authentication and other security controls, if someone's got your username and password, they can then imitate you, they can get into your email, for example, they can use your email account to spread further inside your organization and externally as well, to customers, to suppliers, etc. All the way through to impersonation attacks. Everybody sort of heard of impersonation attacks? Yeah, a couple, sort of quite, it goes by a whole bunch of different names. Impersonation, business email compromise, CEO fraud. Bottom line is these attacks all are pretty similar in that there is no malware, which makes it very difficult to detect these things unless you're using the right technology. But it's all pure social engineering, basically trying to trick you into divulging information, either giving up intellectual property, giving up personal data. For example, one of the names this also goes by is P60 or W2 fraud, which is the name for P60s in the US, because they'll impersonate, for example, the CEO emailing the head of HR saying, oh, can you send me all the P60s for all of our staff? You can imagine if you fall for that, which people have. Think about the amount of personal data that sits in P60s. That's pretty scary. So there's a whole bunch of different attack vectors becoming more targeted, a lot more sophisticated. Attackers are doing their research. They're not just blanket blasting a whole bunch of people. They're actually looking at your organization, researching your organization, researching the people that work inside your organization, and targeting those attacks for maximum impact. All sounds pretty scary, but it's reality, unfortunately. But having the right malware protection is absolutely key. So, some of the things I've talked about, these are some of the mechanics of how these work. So we'll get emails with malicious URLs, we'll get emails with weaponized attachments, quite often used in things like ransomware attacks. We'll get the malwareless attacks like I talked about, which, yeah, again, can be quite tricky to catch and stop. But Mimecast can help you with that. And one that some people don't think about, quite often when we think about an attack, we think about somebody outside trying to come in. But we don't always think about the insiders. And by insiders, I think when most of us think about insiders, we think about some malicious person, somebody who may have felt wronged by the organization, maybe they didn't get a promotion, whatever the case may be, sort of sitting there trying to cause damage, and they do exist. Call them malicious insiders, but most of the case they're actually compromised insiders. And what I mean is, these are people, for example, that have fallen for a phishing attack. They've given their credentials unwittingly to an attacker who's now using them and their account to spread malware, to spread infection across the organization and externally. So what are the things we should be doing? Clearly, you've got to have the right level of protection. And the fact that most of you are Mimecast customers is great. Hopefully, most of you, if not all, have the latest protection, for example, with our targeted threat protection suite. But the point I want to make is standard sort of email, sort of spam protection, virus protection will not protect us anymore. So it still needs to be there just to deal with the amount of rubbish that's out there. But without the right level of targeted attack protection, if you like, a lot of these types of attacks will get through to inboxes. People will click on links, they'll be phished. Ransomware will infect the organization. I'm not trying to scare, but I think we all know this is reality. So it really is important to look at what level of protection you have and to make sure that it is the right level of protection to protect against these more sophisticated and targeted attacks. The other point, and Matt mentioned this as well, is user awareness. Technology can play a key part. Yes, technology can stop a lot of these attacks before they get anywhere near your inbox. But all of us as users have to play a part as well. And you know, training somebody on their first day in the company, in the firm is better than nothing. but it's not enough. So you can't just expect to sort of take somebody through the security policy on their first day and say, okay, there, off you go. It's got to be consistent, it's got to be continual, and ideally, you don't want it just to be sort of in a classroom environment or an online course or something like that. So again, technology can play a part here. So for example, some of you may have this switched on already in your system, but every time somebody, or for a proportion of clicks that people make on links, before they go to the destination page, they'll actually see a security tip, a security message, which is powered by Mimecast, to say, are you sure you want to go to this site? This is where you're actually going, because sometimes that's not actually clear in the email itself. This is who the email actually came from, because again, it's very easy to manipulate and for an email to look like it's come from somebody that it actually hasn't. So just making people think before they click, just part of their usual daily activity. It's not a classroom course, it's not an online course, helps with that awareness. So just another thing to think about. The other thing is, and this comes into the protection, but also the response side, is having the information about what's happened, the logs, who clicked on what, where did this email come from, what happened to it, who opened it. All of that kind of information when it comes to, and we'll talk about breach notification in a minute, but when it comes to that, and we've got a significantly larger obligation when it comes to breach notification under GDPR, all of that information can be really, really helpful to shorten the amount of time it takes to understand what's happened and be able to go to the supervisory authority like the ICO here in the UK with more information than I think would be breached. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I wanted to put this up. Firstly, because we just published this yesterday, so I thought it was pretty timely. But it just reinforces the point around not all security and protection is the same. So this is, I don't know if any of you are aware of this, we call this the email security risk assessment. We run these things on a continual basis. Every quarter we put out an aggregated report. This is the latest one, as I said, we published yesterday. And you'll see that basically what this is saying is we've looked at over 95 million emails within specific companies that are not currently Mimecast customers. They're using email security from X number of different vendors. But these are all the things that, if Mimecast were in place, we would have actually caught and stopped, which the incumbent system hadn't. And all these companies naturally think that they're pretty well protected. Some of the more scary ones, I think, are almost 10,000 dangerous file types, and that is something that a pretty standard security system should catch all of those, arguably. What's also scary is 23,000 impersonation attacks made their way through to individuals' inboxes. So this report, you can access this report on mimecast.com. It's quite interesting reading. As Mimecast customers, at least you know that you're not in this kind of shape. For those of you who aren't, perhaps it's just something to consider and think about. And we tend to find this is a good tool to help that conversation with the board and those that sort of need to perhaps haven't quite come around to the thinking that you need to revisit perhaps systems that were put in place X number of years ago. Okay, so we're going to move on to data leak prevention. Again, not new technology, not a new concept. Is everybody familiar with data leak prevention? Know what it means? I'm seeing some nods, some not. But essentially what it is it's a way of stopping specific types of information getting out of the company. So from an email perspective, it's a policy or rule that would sit on the email gateway, which is the link between the outside world and your organization. And you can put these rules in place to say, if somebody tries to send this type of information, perhaps it could be specific keywords, it could be specific types of content. From a GDPR perspective, it could be things like national insurance numbers, telephone numbers, other personally identifiable information. And if the system detects that somebody's trying to send something like that to somebody, to a place it shouldn't be going, either outside the company or even internally within the organization, it can stop that. It won't let that email go. So this is useful both from a GDPR point of view, but also from a just protecting intellectual property, protecting sensitive information. It doesn't have to just be personal information. Hugely powerful. It's tried and tested technology, pretty easy to set up. In fact, Mimecast has a set of pre-built dictionaries, so you can say, okay, checkbox, I want to protect this type of information, and that can be set up fairly quickly, fairly simply, and that can go a long way to stop information getting out, which may be the start of a breach.
And what happens if a keyword is found? Is it put to holding pen or?
You can decide basically what happens with it, but yes, essentially it'll go into a hold queue which can be accessed by IT administration if needed, but essentially it will not be delivered. Yeah. And the important point here, I think, is traditionally this is thought about as stopping stuff getting outside the company, but I mentioned too that this can be used inside the organisation as well. So one of the Mimecast products, if you like, is targeted threat protection, internal protection, right? So there may be people inside your firms where person A has a legitimate reason to view and access some data, person B doesn't. Person A may not realize that person B doesn't and tries to either intentionally or most of the time inadvertently send that information. Again, that can be stopped because even if it's internal, if it goes to someone who has no authority or no reason to see that information, that can be the start of a breach. Okay, again, Matt mentioned encryption earlier. You'll hear quite a bit about this when you start reading some of the content around GDPR, some of the guidance that's been coming out. But essentially, a breach is an incident where somebody's personal data is accessed and can be used to their detriment. If you suffer a breach, but the information that somebody can access is encrypted to a good standard, and they can't get hold of the encryption keys to unencrypt it, well then arguably they can't use that information. That information can't be harmful to that data subject, and therefore, and I'm not here to give legal advice, but in my view, if you can demonstrate that, or if you know that if you believe something has happened, you believe perhaps a breach has happened, but you are confident that any information that could have been accessed is fully encrypted and can't be unencrypted by the person who may have stolen it, then arguably that's not a breach, because it is not going to harm that individual, that data subject. So encryption is a really, really important technology. Encryption of data as it's moving around in transit, but also encryption at rest. So when the data is sitting in an archive or in some other data store. And again, this applies to email, but think about this across your other systems as well, whether it's document management, case management systems, etc. What level of encryption is in place? Who manages those keys? These are all important questions, but could be really, really important from a GDPR point of view and being able to demonstrate the steps you've taken to protect data. Okay, breach notification. This is one of the areas where there's actually been quite a significant change. And the biggest change, in my view, is the 72 hours. So under GDPR, you have 72 hours to notify the authorities of a breach. Now, the big difference here is the 72 hours starts as soon as you become aware that something may have happened. So if somebody in your organization comes to you, or you uncover something yourself, or the relevant person inside your organization has become aware of something, and they suspect that there may be some sort of breach, that is when the 72 hours starts. 72 hours is not a lot of time. and within that 72 hours, you have to notify the relevant authorities, and potentially, depending on what's actually happened, notify the individual data subjects who may have been affected by this breach. And the authorities are not okay if you go to them and say, look, I think something has happened. Okay, that's good, but you're going to need more information. So again, coming back to the point I made about having the right tools to be able to investigate a little bit as to what has happened, having the logs to be able to go through for the relevant people in your organisations to go through and say, okay, this is what's happened. It's either come through email, it's come through somewhere else. This is what happens. It's some sort of internal breach, whatever the case may be. But being able to process that quite quickly and go through that, to be able to stay within that 72 hours is going to be a key requirement. Okay, so that covers off the data protection piece. I know I've kind of whizzed through that fairly quickly, but again, happy to take questions now or at the end, or come and grab anyone at the end as well. But let's talk about the data management side. And one of the things you've probably heard most about, and you heard about this morning as well, subject access requests. This is probably the most fundamental thing that that GDPR makes available to all of us as data subjects. So we can go to any company we believe holds information on us from the 25th of May and say, I want to know what you have on me. So from a personal point of view, I think this is fantastic, because for so long we all battle against, I know this company has information, I don't want to hear from them anymore, or I don't believe they have any legitimate reason to hold my data. Now I can go to these companies and make that request. Good news for all of us as individuals, perhaps not as good for any of us who are responsible for having to process these requests for our organizations. But technology, process and people have got to come together to make this happen. Certainly from an email perspective, can you give me a show of hands, people in the room? I know a lot of you using Mimecast. How many of you are archiving email, either with Mimecast or someone else? Okay, vast majority. Great. So all of that email data largely is going to sit in the archive. Certainly Mimecast customers, any email ever sent or received, either externally, internally, wherever, is going to sit in that archive in an immutable fashion, right? Nobody can tamper with it. You can prove the chain of custody. As part of a subject access request, you've got to be able to go into that repository and find that needle in a haystack, find that individual person's data across all that email. And again, this applies to other systems, but we're obviously focusing on the conversation this morning in email. But being able to find that information can be tricky without the right tools. Thankfully, with things like Mimecast's e-discovery capabilities, as well as new tools like our case review app, which allows you to sort of go through search results and really fine-tune and work through to pinpoint the very specific data that you're looking for, can really help speed up the process, and you can be confident that you're getting the full result, because the last thing you want is inconsistency when it comes to this, because ultimately what you're providing off the back of this is information to that data subject to say, this is everything we hold on you. Now, off the back of one of those requests, there could be a number of things that could be kicked off. One of them could be a request to move data. So I, as a data citizen, can go to an organization and say, okay, tell me everything you hold on me. Okay, now I understand what you hold on me. Actually, I don't want you to hold this data. I want somebody else to hold this data. I'll give you the example, my accountant, right? My accountant holds a huge amount of personal data on me. I'm very happy with my accountant, but if I did choose to move, I wouldn't want to go to my existing accountants and say, look, I want to know everything you hold on me from a personal data perspective. Thank you very much, I now understand that. Actually, I'm moving to this other firm of accountants, I'd like you to extract all of my data and I want you to provide it to them. And I'm perfectly within my rights to request that under GDPR. And all of us have to comply with that. So we have to be able to find it, we have to be able to export it, and we have to export it in a readable format, so it can't be some obscure format that nobody can access or open. And it has to be ported securely. So if you put all of the security in place to make sure that when the data is sitting inside your organization, as soon as you move it, what you don't want is all of a sudden for that data to be less protected or not protected at all, because that is obviously there's a potential for breach there. So when you're moving that data, you've got to think about how you move it, how you can move it securely and provide it to whichever third party it needs to go to. We talked about this one, right to be forgotten. Again, off the back of a subject access request, I can ask for my data to be moved, either provided to me or to another third party, but equally I can request it for it to be deleted. Now, quite often we hear from people, like I get the question, well, do we have to delete it? And it's quite a murky world when it comes to responding to that. But very basically, no, not necessarily. So there could be other reasons why you are required to hold that data and you can't delete it. There could be other regulations that are in play that actually override GDPR. And in certain industries, this is more prevalent than in others. But it's not as clear-cut as somebody asks for their data to be deleted and you have to delete it. If there is a legitimate reason to not remove it, then as long as you can provide that reason and explain why, you have an obligation to keep either all or some of their data. Perhaps you can delete some of it, but there's other pieces of data you can't delete of theirs, then that's fine. And if you can demonstrate that to the authorities, if somebody kicks up a stink and says, well, they haven't removed my data, then that's cool. But I think it's not as clear cut. But from an email perspective, thinking about all that data in the archive, how do you remove it? Because it's designed to be immutable. You're not supposed to be able to tamper with it, and removing it arguably is tampering with it. You're not changing the data, but you're removing it. So you may have a retention policy that says, okay, I want to keep everything for 10 years, 30 years, 100 years, whatever the case may be. Mimecast gives you the ability to be able to go in and off the back of an e-discovery search, be able to go into the archive and say, actually, I need to remove this data, and be able to set up a data purge, if you like, just for that specific data. So it doesn't impact the rest of the archive. It doesn't remove the immutability to be able to go and delete something and then put it back on. It retains the immutability, it retains the chain of custody, but it does allow you to purge specific information off the back of a search that you've done. So you have the ability to conform to a right to be forgotten as it pertains to email. One of the things I wanted to touch on here, and who's running email on-prem? Who's moved to 365? Who's in 365? Wow. I was expecting a few at least. Okay, so everybody's running email either on-prem or hosted. Yeah? Okay. So the point I was going to make is that an email archive is obviously one repository of email data, but I would imagine that most of you, if not all, are taking a backup of that data as well. And that backup could be in a variety of forms. If it's a tape backup, that makes life a little bit more tricky. If it's a digital backup into the cloud, etc., much more straightforward. But what the point I wanted to make is, when it comes to things like a right to be forgotten, if you're doing all the hard work and you're doing a search and you're finding that data and you're removing it from the archive, what about that data that sits in the backup? And if those two things are separate, arguably you've got to do that process twice. You've got to remove it from the archive, you've got to remove it from the backup. Because if you ever have to recover from your backup, you're potentially inadvertently going to recover that information that should have been removed. So the requirement to back up data doesn't go away. It remains best practice, whether you're on-prem. And if you are thinking about moving to the cloud, whether it's 365 or something else, don't assume they're backing up your data, because they're not. They have resilience in place, but they don't have a backup of your data, and they don't give you an ability to recover to a point in time for your data. So taking a backup is important. With Mimecast, you can have a single repository of your data, and it serves both purposes. You can use it as the archive, and you can also use it as the backup. The beauty of that is that if you do a search and you fulfill a right to be forgotten request, and you purge that data, it purges it from both the archive and from the backup. So you're not going to run the risk of having those two things separate and inadvertently, potentially, being in breach of the regulation by recovering data that should have been removed. Make sense? Cool. How am I doing on time?
Fine.
Okay. I always like to check right at the end. So hopefully this I haven't sort of thrown too much stuff at you this morning. These are all the key areas that we've talked about. From a technology point of view, there are a bunch of technologies and Mimecast products, if you like, or capabilities that sit underneath these things. I talked a little bit about the targeted threat protection, the advanced threat security capability, having the right level of protection to stop those targeted advanced malware and malwareless threats that are coming in. Talked about DLP. One of the things I mentioned was securely moving data. So if you have to provide data to a third party, whether that's the data subject or somebody they've appointed, how do you move that securely? One of the options is the Mimecast Secure Messaging service. One of the things I didn't touch on is our API. And API is Application Programming Interface. It basically is the ability for two disparate systems to talk to each other. But one of the things we actually announced about 10 days ago is our API portal and capability. What that basically means is if you have other systems inside your organizations that you want to, you may have a security system that looks at more than just email, maybe it looks at your network, maybe it looks at other systems you have, you can actually bring Mimecast data into that system through our API, and that can give you better visibility, for example, if you detect that there may be a breach. But I don't want to go into too much detail on that this morning, but it's a capability that's there. Obviously, there's the archive in terms of holding that email data securely, immutably, but at the same time giving you very quick, rapid access to be able to find that information off the back of a subject access request, be able to extract that information in a readable format, supply that to somebody, or be able to remove it by adjusting the retention period for that specific information inside the archive and being able to purge it. Sync and recover is what I talked about around the backup and recovery capability running alongside the archive. And just simple things like role-based access control, which is what RBAC stands for. We love acronyms, but role-based access control simply is, think about your Mimecast implementation, who has access to it, for example. Do all the people that have admin access to it really need admin access to it? What data should or shouldn't they be able to access within the admin console? What should they be able to do when they log in? Thinking about all of these things, again, can just help mitigate the risk of a potential breach. Ultimately, you only want to give people that need access to the information that they need to be able to do their jobs. And sitting underneath all of this is continuity. So putting all of this in place is great when everything's running as it should. But what happens if your email goes down? Whether you're running it yourself, whether somebody's running it for you, whether it's running in the cloud, outages do happen. What happens in that scenario? We heard about DLA their only option was to move to personal email accounts, which is obviously not what you want, because you lose everything that you've just put in place here to protect you and to support your compliance. So being able to maintain access for all of us as individuals to our email is one thing. Maintaining access to the from an administration and search point of view is really important too, because the authority is not going to be too interested if you turn around and say, I couldn't respond to all of these subject access requests because we couldn't do searches because the system was down for X number of days, a week, whatever it is. So maintaining access is important, and that's what the Mimecast continuity service can do from an email perspective. So really just to finish up, we've talked about trying to prevent a breach and the types of things that you can be looking at, from malware protection, data leak prevention, encryption. All of these things are there to help you prevent something going wrong in the first place, prevent a breach, in which case you don't have to worry about everything else. Yes, you still need processes and technology to support this bit, which is managing the data, doing searches, finding information off the back of a subject access request and things like that. But those tools are there for you. And the third piece around maintaining access when everything's going fine, but equally when things are not going fine, when there's some sort of outage, making sure that all of those processes, systems all remain in place, all the security remains in place, even if your primary email system goes down. So when you put all of these pieces together, this is what we talk about it as email cyber resilience. Protection is not enough anymore. We have to assume at some point something is going to get through, whether it comes through email or from something else. But being able to respond effectively, being able to recover effectively, and being able to just maintain business operation, i.e. being able to communicate with our number one communication tool, which is email, is really important. So the Mimecast suite of services helps our customers do exactly that, is sort of fulfill all three areas and really improve their resilience, which is great for GDPR, but it's a necessity today, given the level of attacks that are out there and how important email is to keep all of our businesses going. So that finishes my bit off. So thank you very much for taking the time out. Thank you for listening. As I said, I'll be here till the end of the session, so feel free to hit me with any questions. The really tricky ones I'll pass over to these guys. But there is a question.
Two actually.
Okay.
Thank you very much. You talk about retention and setting retention within Mimecast. Is that within a particular product line, or is that across the sort of default?
Yeah, so retention is a core function of the archive. So if you have the Mimecast archive as a service, if you've subscribed to that service, the ability to set retention, adjust retention, search all the information that is in the archive, that's all a core and included capability within that service.
Thank you. And the other question was obviously the importance of being able to search effectively across different areas, systems. My impression of Mimecast, from what I've seen, and it may be because I'm doing it completely wrong and I'm not a power user or an expert, anything like that, is it does not find certain kind of, it won't find things like certain kinds of data within PDFs, because I don't know if that's a limitation or if you've got unstructured.
Yeah, it doesn't find PDF attachments very well. If you're looking for the subject of a you're touching on the subject name of a PDF attachment, it doesn't always find the attachments. It might find the email, but you can't, even if it finds the attachment, you can't access it.
I mean, for example, if you scan, if someone sends you a CV and you scan it in, and in a rush you haven't actually given it a title or anything like that, when you go back and use the search functionality, I'm not sure that I'm picking up everything that I would
Yeah.
want to pick up.
Yeah, I think what you're kind of
And if
calling
there's a
out.
lot of PII data in those
Yeah.
attachments, then it's kind of, you know you're not completing your search.
Yeah, so I think that there may be where something is scanned. I think is different to where it's a standard document. I guess so. I guess a scan could be seen just as an image, without the ability to see the individual content in there. But let me take that question away and speak to our more technical guy, certainly more technical than me, just to see whether there's something I don't want to give you the wrong response, but let me take that one away and come back. Sorry?
There may be a way round.
Yeah, exactly.
Something that we're not doing, that we should be doing,
Yeah.
perhaps, that's already there in the system.
Okay.
I do have a high-level solution to that. Have you heard of OCR? Optical character recognition.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
when you're scanning a document, Dan was right, he said it becomes an image, so it's not picking up any data, it doesn't convert any of that data, but there's all different types of OCR technology, and it will actually turn that data into readable data.
Yeah.
So then it will then pick up that set of data. So take a look at OCR.
Can I just ask
Sorry,
you a question, please? The first is, does GDPR apply in the case of a former client of yours who's deceased?
No.
Do we,
No.
important reasons we need to keep some of that data?
No, it doesn't. So GDPR only applies to living individuals.
Right.
So that information you can hold. It's information related to them that's possibly a relative or a family member. You need to have clarity on that.
And so the second thing is this, what if there's somebody with whom you have a professional contact, but you have data for non-professional social reasons? For example, his children's date of birth, when he did celebrate the 21st birthday or things like that. Is that affected?
It would fall under GDPR. Because it is part of GDPR. It will fall under GDPR. It's identifying information around an individual, especially capturing information around that person and their children.
I was going to make the point, especially when it comes to children, it's even a higher burden to protect that information, given how sensitive and personal that information is.
Thank you.
So I have a question about data retention. Can that be set at an individual user's level, firstly? And then secondly, when that data retention period is up, does it automatically get wiped, or is there a reminder to say, is this all okay to delete still?
Yeah, good question. So retention policies can be set up at a variety of different levels of granularity. So you can set one retention policy for everybody. You can set retention policies by department, groups, down to individuals. At the end of a set retention period, for argument's sake, maybe it's 10 years, 7 years, that data will be automatically purged. Unless there's something else overriding that. But yes, at the end of that period, that's there is no reason.
There's no flag to say, are you sure you want to?
There may be a flag. I'm not 100% certain, but certainly to remove data before the end of a retention period, that's a manual action and actually requires 2 administrators to complete it. No one single administrator can do that, which is a great security feature. If you've got a rogue admin, for example, who say, I'm going to go and delete a whole bunch of data from the archive, they can't do that. But I will need to double check as to whether there is a flag that flags up. I would imagine that there may well be.
Could I suggest that if there isn't, there ought to be?
Yeah. And that's why I'm thinking that I'm actually thinking about it. I'd be pretty sure.
Because considerations may change during the retention period. And you don't want stuff being automatically deleted without necessarily having a chance to review the position before it is deleted.
Yeah.
And presumably, on an organisation-wide basis, you'd be able to report on the data that's due to be deleted by users so that we can then communicate with each individual user to say,
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean all of these actions are fully logged and audited, so you can get a full view of every action, whether that's a user action or an administrator action within the system, so you can see exactly what's happened when with what
more the sort
data.
of pre-purge report. So here's what's due to be purged due to retention by a user,
Yeah.
and then they can check that and say yes or no.
What do you want in the report? I mean, just volume? Because there's going to be, if it's 10 years later and an individual, there's going to be, I don't know, hundreds of thousands. They're not going to be able to.
Our members, we've talked about needing to do it on a case-by-case basis, because if we arbitrarily or across the organisation pick a retention 10 years,
Yeah.
it really should be 10 years from the end of the case, which is then on a case-by-case basis. And individual cases might then be going to Supreme Court, which is basically 15 years. So,
Just possible in Outlook to have folders by retention
Yeah.
or retention by folders. So if there's that particular instance, they can move all of that case information into the 15-year folder and have it re-stamped in that sense. So giving some control back to the user.
Well, I'll look into the pre-purge sort of report notification as well.
Is there like an idiot's guide in terms of how to kind of use Mimecast effectively, and how as a user you can go in and delete things in your own mailbox from Mimecast?
So the answer to the first part of that question is yeah. I mean, so within our knowledge base, there are guys. I wouldn't necessarily refer to them as idiots, guys, but we've got documentation which is pretty straightforward, easy to follow. The second part of your question around users being able to go in and remove stuff, it all comes back to what the retention on that data is. The whole point of the archive is to stop individuals from messing around with the data. So if there's a policy set up by the organisation that says this data needs to be protected and needs to be archived for 7 years, you wouldn't be as a user, you wouldn't be allowed to go in and do anything with that data. It's immutable. If that retention is not applied to that data, well, yes, you can. But the whole point of an immutable archive is that it takes away the ability for users either accidentally or maliciously removing data that the organisation actually either has a legal or compliance requirement to hold on to.
So if there's a judgment, for example, to say, remove that data from both sides, or which is the sort of request we get quite a lot, you need to define what data set it is, and then we'll carry that out for you. And as Dan said, it requires 2 administrators, so we can't be one person make a mistake. That goes through our own change control, and we get ultimate sign-off from the client as well before pressing the button.
And
So I can see how that would work in a normal organisation, but barristers' chambers aren't normal organisations, and barristers are all self-employed and would probably want control of what's in their archive and what isn't.
I mean, typically it works well. If you think sort of pre-Mimecast or non-archive and just backup data, we get a hell of a lot of requests from people who accidentally delete things or accidentally overwrite, and really we're guarding against that. In this type of organisation, it would be stopping people making mistakes and deleting that whole case file and then going, well, now what? So it can be done. It's just that it's tamper-proof in the first instance, and then we can get through it with 2 keys.